Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session of the Writers' Festival with Anna Funder. We are going to be talking about her new novel, All That I Am. My name is Jason Steger. I edit the books pages of The Age. You probably know Anna from her first book, Stasiland, which was hugely successful, translated into 16 languages, I think, and won Britain's Samuel Johnson Prize. It was an investigation of East Germany before the wall went down, and living under the eyes of the Stasi, the East German secret police. And in it, she chronicled a lot of great acts of courage, moral bravery, people who decided rather than being part of them, we would be us. In her new novel, All That I Am, her first novel, I think there's a continuation of theme in the novel, which tells a story of four characters opposing the Nazi regime, initially in Germany, and then from Britain and from America. Anna, first of all, why did you decide to write a novel about Ernst Toller, Ruth Blatt, and Dora Fabian?
Well, I'd first like to say how nice it is to be in Melbourne. It's my home, and I'm very happy to be here. I wanted to write a novel when I was writing Stasiland, and it would have been the much more sensible kind of career move. Not that I have that kind of sense, but I went to Germany, I had this writer's fellowship, I thought it would all be fantastic, and then I found these amazing stories, and I started to write a novel, and it was just execrable, because the first task of a novel is to make a believable world in which believable characters behave in believable ways. And in East Germany, that just wasn't going to be possible. I had these characters who were almost inhumanely heroic, and others who were inhumanely perfidious. And I wanted to be able to describe East Germany as it was, in a sense to... Pierre Rickman says, writers want to do justice to the visible universe. It is this sense of representing what's real, whether fiction or non-fiction. And East Germany was a place where the secret police would steal your underpants from your flat so that they had a sample of your bodily odour, and they could train a dog to track you and so on. And if you put that into a novel, you've just sort of lost your readers on the first page, partly because it's disgusting and partly because it's just not credible. So somewhere there are these really horrible pages of that early book. So Stasiland, by its nature and by the nature of the material, needed to be non-fiction. But the one thing that I couldn't do, or that I felt was the limit of the discipline of non-fiction, is that you can't describe what something is like from the interior, from someone's consciousness, unless they actually tell you. And then, and people generally don't. I mean, they might say, I was really frightened when I tried to climb the Berlin Wall, or I was uncomfortable when I was interrogating so-and-so, or whatever, but you can't actually represent that properly. So that was the limit. And when I started to write a novel, I actually started to write one before All That I Am, but that was what I wanted to do. It was like getting into a different vehicle. I'd been in the non-fiction vehicle, and now I was getting into fiction and seeing what it could do. So I am representing the consciousness of two individuals, my two narrators, and then all sorts of states of being and states of the human condition, from being in love to being in love with the wrong person, to being betrayed, to being brave and frightened at the same time, to being prescient and blind at the same time. And I think that answers your question.
I'm right in thinking that the novel was inspired by a friend of yours?
Yes. When I finished Stasiland, I started to write this novel that we were just talking before about Jonathan Franzen and autobiographical fiction. I started to write this novel that I thought had nothing to do with my family. And I thought that I would make this friend of mine, Ruth Blatt, into the sort of cantankerous, truth-telling grandmother of this family. I thought that would be quite good. And Ruth Blatt was the woman who taught my German teacher German here in Melbourne. And when I was 19, I was applying for scholarships to go overseas, and through no fault of my German teachers whatsoever, my German was still really execrable. And I said to her, could you please have a look at this application? She's a family friend, and she said, I'm going overseas, but give it to Ruth. So I met this extraordinary woman who seemed ancient to me then. She's probably in her late 70s. And she had a wig and crutches and really bad teeth and was very straight talking. And she had this extraordinary history where she had been in the resistance to Hitler before Hitler came to power. So she was in a tiny splinter party in Germany called the Socialist Workers' Party. When Hitler came to power, she had to leave. And she was in exile in London making anti-Hitler leaflets. And in 1935, she tried to smuggle 150 of those stuck down her pants back into Germany. She was portrayed at the border by another member of this left-wing group who couldn't manage in London. And the price of him being allowed to go back to Germany, not in a concentration camp, was that he deliver up other members of this group to the Gestapo. Ruth Blatt spent 5 years in a prison under Hitler between 35 and 39. So she's a Jewish left-wing activist in Germany in prison in those years. And she was released, and in a kind of very legalistic, typically kind of Nazi gesture, because she had had a trial. She wasn't just shipped off to a concentration camp. They let her out for 24 hours and said, like setting a grouse before hunters or something, and they said, you've got 24 hours before we rearrest you. She managed to get out. She went to China and then she came to Australia. So she was a very good friend of mine and my husband's, and she was at our wedding, and we saw a lot of her over the 15 years till she died in 2001. And I thought she would make a great truth-telling, cantankerous grandmother in my novel. So I started writing this book, and I thought, I had a look at it recently after I finished this. I hadn't been able to look at it for years out of kind of fear and shame. And I pulled it out of the drawer, and I saw that, it had some decent things about it, but I had to stop writing it because part of it didn't have any kind of engine, it wasn't going anywhere. But the other thing was, I was really trying to make a family that bore no resemblance to my own. But I did things like, I've got 2 brothers who I admire and adore and everything. One of them's got quite a green thumb, and I rang him up while I was writing this book, and I said, I was setting a scene in the backyard of the house I grew up in, but I was just using the house, and I was using the tree. And I said to my brother, that tulip tree in our backyard, the flowers, they were green, weren't they? And they went like that, and then they had the orange stripes in them. And my brother said on the phone, you're writing about the tulip tree? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, it's a bit close to home, isn't it? At which point I thought, I better cease and desist here, because I can't, in good conscience, keep going, even though the characters were, I thought, vastly different. But then I thought to myself, well, I think I know all of Ruth's stories. I knew all about her. She had recently died. But I thought, when in doubt, go and read something. So I went and read up about this Socialist Workers' Party that she had belonged to in the 30s, and that's when I came across the story of Dora Fabian and was besotted, was absolutely smitten with this woman who had known Ruth and who'd been a member of this party and who'd been in London. And I just walked around really like a fool in love. I was much nicer to people than I usually am, which I think is a definite sign of infatuation. And that's really where this book comes from. So it comes from a dual fascination with a woman that I know and a woman that I didn't.
So you never spoke to Ruth about Dora?
No.
And nor about Ernst Toller?
No.
Right. So I'd assumed that came from discussions with her.
No, I'm taking it as a great compliment that everyone assumes that everything I've written in this novel is absolutely literally true. And there have been some very interesting pieces in the paper where people say, oh, well, you know, you can wiki this story. And that's of great interest to me because I made it up. So there are lots of kind of traps in that. There are two very basic and important parts of this story that are true. And it's kind of hard to talk about them because, in a sense, part of the plot is a thriller or a kind of murder mystery. But anyway.
It's sort of dangerous ground, isn't it?
Yes, but important ground. So there is the story of one of these refugees. My story is 4 people who are based on real analogues who were in the left-wing groups, this small socialist party in Germany, privileged, well-to-do writers and journalists, and as soon as Hitler comes to power, they have to leave. One of them has been writing satirical articles in the paper about Hitler, commenting on, his hair loss and his moustache and his habits and all sorts of things. And I had great fun incorporating real articles that Hans Wiesemann wrote into this novel. And then later in Germany, he can't in London, he can't manage. And the real Hans Wiesemann did betray his friend Bertolt Jacob as the price of going back to Germany. And that's true. And the other part of the story, I mean, there's lots and lots of things that, like a magpie, I've grabbed that are absolutely real. And but plot-wise, the other bit that's important is the discovery in March 1935 of 2 women dead in a perfectly neat, locked bedroom in a flat in Great Ormond Street in Bloomsbury. These 2 political activists. And one of them is my main character. And what I didn't want to do was to start a book with a dead woman, because every time I turned on the television, I see CSI and CSI Miami and NCIS and every other acronymed primetime show that starts, probably doesn't actually, it's probably just when I turn it on, but starts with a young dead woman on a slab. And the dramatic tension in those programs, which is obviously extremely successful, maybe I should have started with a dead woman on a slab. But the dramatic tension is between the forensic detectives and the killer. And I didn't want that to be the case. I wanted my heroine to be alive, and I wanted her to want to keep being alive, despite the ridiculously brave things that she was doing to call attention to what Hitler was doing.
She is the most extraordinary character, though, isn't she? She is, as you say, she's full of life, and yet as the book goes on, this sort of sense of fear is which I think the tension comes from the fear that seems to be increasing as you read the book. In terms of dealing, though, with real characters, historical characters, what did you see as your responsibility towards them? Or did you see them just as fair game?
No, not at all as fair game. I think it's very important to get things, it sounds kind of highfalutin in some way, but it's important to get things morally right. So it's important to know about the history enough so that you know what people did and you're not misrepresenting them. I think that's very important. That was an issue that I thought about a lot in relation to a very beautiful film that many of you may have seen called The Lives of Others, where a Stasi man is taken as the moral centre of that film, and he has a change of heart and he tries to save the people that he's been spying on. And that never ever happened once ever in the history of East Germany. And it seemed to me, for a variety of reasons that I wrote about in The Guardian, that if you're looking for heroes in that situation, or in a situation of the Nazi regime in Germany, you probably wouldn't first, or I wouldn't first, look for a moral hero among the Gestapo or among the Stasi, when there were many, and I found them and told the stories in Stasiland, who were resisting that. So getting those sorts of things right was really important to me. The main violence that I did to history, I have to say, or to the characters that you're talking about here, is I have looked very, very hard at everything I could find in London, everything I could find in Berlin, with the help of a terrific historian, of the facts of these cases, of what Nazi operatives were allegedly doing in London in the very early 30s, which was a story that absolutely shocked me and fascinated me because people didn't believe it then. And I've been in London for pre-publicity for this book, and they are shocked about it now. I mean, I still kind of find it shocking. But looked very hard at all of that, and then I've put together a plot which seems to me most likely is not provable. The inquest says these political activists died of romantic suicide. Seems very unlikely to me, but this is a novel. I've actually strung the plot together. In terms of characters, the main, I mean, obviously they're made up. The relationship between Dora and Ernst Toller is referred to on the historical record as a scrap in a letter from one friend to another saying, we hear that Dora has allegedly had an unhappy relationship with Ernst Toller. So that loving relationship is, I don't know, a third of the book. It's necessary and it's necessarily invented. The main thing that I did that you're asking me about twisting things or out of shape was that my villain was so much worse than I have made him. And I had to pull back, you know, I had to really make him credible. It's a bit like dealing with the Stasiland issues. To make this man credible, I had to not include some of the really outrageous things that he did because I wanted him to be a character that we could have some kind of sympathy with. And I found that actually with both of these books, that reality really outstrips what is credible in fiction. So it's more a matter of withholding than of any kind of exaggeration.
I'm glad you mentioned the fact that they didn't know in Britain. I mean, I was really shocked when I read that. And there was an inquest, but you went to look at you tried to find the and it's all disappeared, isn't it?
Yeah, so I went out to the archives at Kew in London. I mean, I didn't do, I did probably about 18 months research, but while I was doing that, I was, the characters were taking shape in my mind and so on. And I did probably too much research because it gets quite addictive and, it replaces the harder work of writing. Yeah, I did go out to the inquest to look at the inquest file at Kew, and it was delivered to me. And it's a manila folder, and on it it's got written in this sort of scrawly 1930s handwriting reference to other bits of the file, but you open it up and there's about 2 pages in there and the rest of it has been removed. That may that may mean something, it may not mean something, I don't know. I mean, I don't make it mean anything in the book, I just say that that's what happened in the end.
It's a fascinating fact that it's disappeared, I think. But thematically, you're very interested in acts of bravery, aren't you? Acts of bravery and seeing what is happening, I think. Seeing what's going on around, and some people choosing to, like Dora, in an almost reckless fashion, choosing to act, and others who choose not to. Blindness, I guess, moral blindness. That was one of the driving elements of the book?
I am very admiring of moral courage, I think I probably don't have that much of it, and so I think I probably admire it in other people. And we've had Malalai Joya here this week, and it's been extraordinary to meet her. I think that this book, the novel, is really a lot about what we let ourselves see and what we don't. Even at the level of a marriage, there's a whole lot of willful blindness that goes on. We don't want to see certain things about our partners or our lives. And at the political level, that goes on too. And I'm very interested in people who are... It's not just a matter of intelligence or prescience or something. It's actually quite brave to really see what's going on around you and to really call it. And the world is full of facts and information, and never more so than now we can get access to anything. But there's a tiny little sub-thread that goes through this book where one of the minor characters is in New York. She's Ernst Toller's secretary, and she's taking down his memoirs. He's written this quite self-serving autobiography, which the real Ernst Toller did. It's actually a lovely read. But like a lot of important or perhaps self-important men, there's nothing personal in this book. There's nothing about who he loved. And I think at the end of our lives, it really is our loves that we remember most, and that is what made us who we are, and that is what's most important to us. And so he is, for his part of the narration, he's sitting in this hotel room narrating Dora, his great love, back into his memoir. And so Clara, this character, is typing up the story of their relationship and literally sticking that into the other book for the publisher. But her brother is trying to escape Germany, and he's on a boat called the St. Louis. And this really happened. So there was a boat full of Jews trying to escape Europe in 1939, trying to get to America, and they were turned back by the American Coast Guard, and they were turned back by the Canadians for domestic political reasons. And you can't kind of see that without thinking of enormous contemporary relevances. And so that was another kind of excitement really in the book, is to see those kinds of parallels.
And there's another moment where you have Ernst Toller when he's still in Germany, campaigning against the First World War, towards the end of the First World War, and he says they dress it up as a fight for ideals, but. So this is he's talking, and I cried from chairs in factory canteens or beer halls or from the backs of trucks, but they sent us to die for oil, for gold, for land. I mean, the modern parallels are extraordinary, I think.
Yeah, and he did say that, and he did get up in trucks, and that's exactly what he said. And I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes I am subject to this kind of perhaps now outdated Enlightenment idea that, the world gets better and better and we all get wiser and wiser. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case, and I think that there are certain social and personal dynamics that repeat themselves, and certainly going to war, dressing up wars as wars for particular ideals when the economics of them are also very clear, is something that repeats and repeats and repeats itself.
Yes, and you have to look at Libya.
Well, yes. I mean, this story, in a sense, is kind of both of them, really. I mean, I happen to have a sort of a duckling experience with Germany, so I was young enough to go and study in Berlin and before the wall fell, and was kind of imprinted with that. But if I'd studied French instead and gone to Africa, I could have written a story about an African country, or I could have written it about Italy, or I could have written it, or not Italy, but I could have written about Libya or China or Burma. These sorts of situations where there is an illegitimate and unjustified power of government and then resistance against it replay themselves everywhere.
I wondered about actually writing fiction. How did you find it difficult?
No, I found it a liberation, much easier than
Really?
Yes.
And had you written fiction before, stories and yeah. I mean, there's at the beginning of a chapter that where you're talking from Ruth's point of view when she has Toller's manuscript that she's referring to. And she says, it gives me a kind of vertigo to be inside Toller looking at Dora. And so you're narrating as Ruth. So did you ever get that sort of vertigo? This idea that this sort of, you're looking at Ruth, and then she's looking at Toller, and then looking at Dora through all those perspectives.
I just like to point out that makes the book seem much more complicated than it is. Very simple little story, 2 threads.
Yeah, it does.
It makes the book to sound like a Matryoshka doll, which it's not.
No.
No, the parts, Ruth is, so Toller is narrating in his hotel room. He's trying to do justice to the love of his life, Dora. So we hear about her from his point of view. Ruth is an old woman. I put her in Sydney, even though she's from Melbourne, because I live there and because it's easier to describe the sort of venal fecundity of Australia if you're in Sydney, because it's worse or better. But the parts that are narrated, for instance, from Ruth's point of view, and I have to say that this Ruth has, the real Ruth was much nicer. This one has kind of parts of my caustic nature have sadly seeped into her. But anyway, she's kind of fun. She's cantankerous. But the parts that are narrated from Sydney that are all, that I didn't have to tie into anything that was historical, were pure joy to write. They're just really very easy. I mean, and the whole, her relationship with her housekeeper, and
Bev, yes, she's formidable.
Formidable, frightening, and Ruth goes to hospital and all the things that happened to her there, and that was just really lovely. Really.
And easy, I mean, you've got the two voices. Easy to get the two voices?
Well, Toller is depressed, and he was actually manic depressive. And I've got a tiny reference to his mania, but in the phase where he's narrating this, he's depressed. Ruth is not depressed, but she does say, why did God save me and not all those other people? And that's something that my friend, the real Ruth, did used to say to me. And the main problem with that for her was that she didn't believe in God. So she was in a battle with a God that she didn't believe in. And so Ruth is questioning and feels slightly undeserving of her survival. And I think that that is something which is called survivor guilt, which is common and serious and deep. Those two moods are not so incredibly different. So, yeah, they weren't hard to get, but they're different. Yeah. I quite like being a bloke, I have to say. For reasons we can or cannot go into, depending on.
But I wondered, there's a bit where Toller talks about creative work, and he says this is the trick to creative work. It requires a slip state of being, not unlike love. Did you find that? Did you find that once you were writing the novel, was this sort of an all-embracing affair with the book, and it sort of took over your life to some extent?
Yes, I did. And I think, I mean, it's so easy to generalise about everybody, but I do think, certainly for myself, that really good writing comes from some kind of love. Not any sort of soppy romantic love, but from a real passion for what it is that you have to say and why it is that this story has to be told and these people have to be brought to life. And for me, that is a hugely motivating factor. And it also, the slipstream of it means that, you know, people talk about writer's block and so on. That is a kind of, to my mind, something that's brought about by a sort of self-consciousness or a sort of self-concern. Whereas if you're other-directed, like you are when you're in love, if you're thinking about the other person, the object, the thing you want to create, this book that you want to exist, and then it liberates you from yourself. It liberates you from self-consciousness, and I think it's very important. I think you can almost tell, book by book, even with the same writers, which ones have been animated by this sort of love, for want of another word, or passion, and which ones have been put together without it.
You must be a very perceptive reader.
I'm almost talking in metaphorical terms here. I don't mean that I'm literally, my heart is palpitating or anything, but I do think that is a way to get yourself writing and to get yourself outside of yourself.
I also had I got reading the book, I got a sense that you had a lot of fun actually as well with some of the minor characters. I thought you had a lot of fun with Fenner Brockway, for example, who I remember when he was still alive, a British Labour peer he was when I knew of him, and also W.H. Auden, who had sort of popping up to visit Ernst Toller. Was that fun for you, doing those scenes?
Yes, well, I'm glad you think it was fun. It was fun. It was fun. It was fun to write. It's well, you have your heart in your mouth a little bit. Auden was friends with Toller. Auden did visit Toller in New York when Toller was very depressed here at the end. Auden also translated Toller's work into English, and so I've been fortunate enough to be allowed to reproduce at the beginning of the book and in the third section some of Auden's translations of Toller. And Auden wrote a very beautiful elegy after Toller died. And I have Auden turning up slightly dishevelled and chain-smoking.
As he was.
As he was. In Toller's hotel room, and the waiter delivers soup in a soup tureen, and Auden, tucks his napkin in and hops into it as if the world has kind of anticipated him, and it must be for him, this soup, And then they have a conversation. As part of that conversation, Auden does say things that the real Auden did say. I mean, this scene is all of 3 pages or something. That was fun. I had a lot of fun with Bev, who is Ruth's sort of housekeeper come carer at the end, because one of the things that I wanted to show in the book is kind of fundamental decency that I see everywhere in lots of people. I mean, the program that we did the other day where we were talking about Kinglake 350, and that's one of the most moving things, I think, that you see in all sorts of situations, people just behaving really generously and kindly to one another. And I think Bev is a real pain, but she's really basically decent, and I loved writing her.
I mean, it's a question of that common humanity, isn't it, really?
Yes, exactly.
I think, yeah. Going back to your research, I noticed at the end of the book you acknowledge the people who now live at number 12, Great Ormond Street. What was it like going into the flat?
Oh, look, so this very dear character and then another character found dead in this bed, as they really were. And then the next bit of the book is the inquest, which is very, very similar to the real inquest that happened in London at this time of great appeasement, where the inquest, the coroner said, as he really did say, "I will admit no evidence of political activity in this courtroom." So this, if I'm to be believed, is a political assassination, and yet that it's gone down as romantic suicide. So I wrote from Australia in 2006 to the resident, top floor, flat, 12 Great Ormond Street, Bloomsbury, saying, I'm writing a book and it's set in your place, and would it be possible to come and visit? Anyway, I didn't hear anything back, and my children and my husband and I, we went to London for 6 weeks so that I could do some research on the book. And Charmian Brinson, who was the historian whose work was important to me writing this, and I rang her up and said, I'm going to go and knock on the door of this flat. And she's very English and very proper, and she was slightly horrified. And then she was curious, and we went together and rang the doorbell, and this very nice young Pakistani refugee came down and said, I'm assuming he's a refugee, they were fairly new arrivals, and said, yes, we got your letter, we just didn't have time, we've got a new baby, couldn't get back to you, come on up. So Charmy and I went upstairs in this place in Bloomsbury, and then up these little rickety stairs into this flat that's under the roof, because I wanted to see where they lived and where they died. And of course we couldn't say anything to this family at the time that we are coming here, and then because we want to see where these people died. I thought that wouldn't be very nice, but they were incredibly kind, and we went into this front room, which is where it happened, and his wife was there in a kind of beautiful sari thing, breastfeeding her baby, and it was a very it was a beautiful thing to see, and it was also very moving because I knew what had happened there 70 years before, and that, you know.
And you didn't tell them,
No.
but they will, presumably, assuming that they're still there, or whoever is living there now is going to find out, presumably, when the book is published, and they'll have lots of people, well, not necessarily lots of people coming around, but...
I don't know, maybe they should charge entry, maybe they've done them a great favour.
It's the book is quite damning about the English authorities at the time, isn't it? I mean, it seems to me to be very critical of their not accepting any political activity, and the idea that the refugees were only allowed to stay there on the proviso that they didn't engage in political activities.
Yes, well, I mean, I had no intention to be damning about anyone. I'm just representing, it's a bit like the TPVs here. I was just saying these are the conditions in which my characters lived, and their real analogues lived. So they escaped from Germany. This is long, long before the war, so it's 33. No one knows anything that's going to happen, although my characters suspect it. And they are given asylum in England on condition that they can't work, so they're poor, and that they do not engage in any kind of political activity. So, for obvious reasons, those are very difficult conditions to live under if you are a political activist who has made a living writing for papers and journals about what's going on, and because the reason that you're in exile is a political one. So they had to live from handouts from various refugee relief committees. And there were some very kind, well-connected people in the House of Lords and elsewhere who were running committees and helping these refugees. But the general sentiment in Britain, as is well known, was one of appeasement. I mean, people were coming out of... the people in power had been through the First World War and just devastated by it and did not want to believe that Hitler was rearming. Hitler wasn't allowed to rearm under the Treaty of Versailles, but he was busy making ammunition and planes and training literally millions of men disguised as gymnastics on battlefields and things. And some of these things were known. My characters managed to get very high-level documents out detailing the number and types of warplanes and their range and their weapons. And get them. Dora was very well connected, and she had Seymour Cox and Winston Churchill read that information into Parliament. That's it. Actually happened that those politicians read it in. I don't know that she was their source, but that's an example of there being information on the record, like having ships off the coast or something. We can intellectually, you can know that something is going on, but it's another thing entirely to get action going on it. So. It's quite well known that Churchill was ringing the bell on this early on, but no one was listening.
Yes, I mean, we went beyond the peace in our time, of course, and far from it. I mean, there's lots of... The book is full of acts of courage. It's also... there are acts of cowardice and treachery. It seems to me that there is a thin line between heroism and cowardice.
In which bits do you think that?
Well, I mean, the way you portray Hans Wesselmann,
yes,
you know, he could have gone a different way easily, yes. and it's really, I mean, it's almost his ego that sent him one way.
Yes.
So there, in terms of on the scale of things, you know, just perhaps one sort of little bit more on one side.
I think it's a very human thing. I think none of us know really what we're going to do until we're tested. You know, life can take you really by surprise, and you can take yourself by surprise and not be able to anticipate it. And I suppose one of the things about this book, and to some extent also about Stasiland, is people discover in themselves unknown reservoirs of courage. And for Dora, and for Malalai, who's here at the moment, and for Anna Politkovskaya, who I've written about in another context, I think that there are some people who are so brave, they just keep speaking out against whether it's Hitler or Putin or the warlords in Afghanistan. And they know full well that they are courting disaster, but they can't stop, or they won't stop, because they decide that their sense of themselves and their sense of responsibility for the other people around them outweighs those risks. And that's the point of heroism, which is actually really very common, and so extraordinary about human beings, that really interests me. And on the other side, of course, all of us, well, I certainly know that you can be tested and then found wanting. You think that you have a certain kind of strength and you might not at the end. And those areas of what we don't know about ourselves are very interesting for a novelist, because they can be vast and surprising elephant traps in the psyche, really.
And do you have another novel in mind?
Yes.
Which you've started already? To do with Germany?
No. I was trying really hard to get away from Germany, as I said. Not that I don't like it, but I just didn't set out to write books about Germany. I mean, I was thinking about this, and because I've got 3 small children, we watch children's movies, so my metaphors are likely to be about them. But we were watching this movie called Ants, which is about an ant colony, and I think it's a Disney movie or something. It's a cartoon, and if you were thinking about that or pitching it, you wouldn't say, I'm going to make this movie about ants. It's about a colony. There's a queen. There's all these workers, and they have to get all this food and store it up for winter. And then they, something goes wrong, and they don't have the food. It's like, your eyes would glaze over. And in the same, how you would pitch that movie is to say, there's a young ant who's an idiot, but he makes good, gets the girl, saves the colony. So this is a terrible thing to say, because I love Germany, but I don't expect anybody else to. I'm kind of using Germany as the ant colony here, and I'm exploring the behaviour in extremis that particular place and culture threw up in the 20th century, because that's where you can see it most clearly. And in All That I Am, because it takes place between 33 and 35, as a reader, of course, we all know what happened after that. That's part of our cultural heritage, but that's not in the book. This is before then. So, yeah.
And when Stasiland was published in Germany, there was a fair bit of fuss about it, wasn't there? Is All That I Am going to be published in Germany?
Yes, it's coming out in 16 countries, and Germany is February. Yep. And
do you think? Are you nervous at all about the reception in Germany of it?
At the moment, I'm getting these really lovely questions from the German translator. At one point, I've got Ruth looking, and I've got sneakers hang dancing on an electric wire. You know how people tie the laces together and they throw them over the electric wire. And I have these very serious, lovely German questions coming back saying, what is a sneaker and hang dancing? And so I go back to the hotel and I explain, that hang dancing I made up, but break dancing, I come from the 80s, I don't know, and long story. So I have kind of small areas of nervousness about the translation, but no, the issue with Stasiland, which got a really fantastic critical reception, was that, well, I can tell the story. It was launched in Leipzig in the former ballroom of the Stasi, so the secret policeman's, literally the former ballroom. And
so it was a secret policeman's ball, really?
It was a secret policeman's ball, and funnily enough, there were former secret policemen there. So this is 2004, and I was about 3 or 4 months pregnant, and I was really happy to be at the Leipzig Book Fair, and I was really happy that this was happening in that building, because Stasiland starts when I'm going on a trip to Leipzig and I'm going to that building. Anyway, my German publisher at the time got up and gave this speech, and I was standing waiting, and she gave the speech and she said, she's West German, and she said, well, here we are, Easterners and Westerners, and what we all must remember that we have in common is, and I was thinking she's going to say something lovely and uplifting and we'll all be here together. And she goes, what we have in common is betrayal. Oh, and I just thought, oh man, this is not going to be good. And then, of course, I had to do it all in German, so I can't really tell any jokes, and it has to be all serious. So I get up and I get behind a podium. I love to have a podium. It kind of feels a bit protected. And I'm going to give this speech, and I look down, and the first 2 rows are full of middle-aged men with brill cream on and bomber jackets with their hands like this, looking absolute daggers at me. Now, I don't know whether they were Stasi or Party or both, but they were something, and they were really, really cranky. And then I start talking, and almost like a pantomime or something, they reach into their pockets and they get out these notepads and they start scribbling down all this. But at that moment, it just got too ridiculous for me, and I just thought, like the fear, you talk about those moments of fear and courage, like at that moment, the fear just kind of changed in me, and I thought, who do you think you're taking notes for now? You don't have any files anymore. And I can deal with this. And what happened was they stared daggers at me, scribbled loudly on these bits of paper, and then I gave my speech and my reading. And then as soon as it was opened up for questions, because these are men, to put it mildly, unused to free speech and unused to being criticised, they all totted out of the room. And then it was opened up to the public, and there were many people who stood up and it was very, very moving and said, why aren't these stories being told in Germany? Why does it take a foreigner to come and do this? I was in prison for X years, blah, 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 blah. But those people could only talk once these frightening fellows who probably lived in the same building or around the corner and are busy, having threatening cups of coffee out on the streets still, had gone. So I just tell that as a way of describing how the reception was. It was very much divided between people who had belonged to the Stasi, the army, the party, also academics who had been closely involved with the regime, and then everybody else. So the critical reception was like that. This one is further back in history, and I'm talking about very brave people who are unknown and who tried very early. I'm talking about a theme of German history which is like people who, Toller says at one point, no one is going to remember me and no one is going to remember this other Germany. We tried so hard to save it. And there were a lot of people who did, and I would hope that would be something that would be not as difficult to think about as the more recent past was in Stasiland.
Yeah, I agree, I'm sure. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question.
I was just interested, you said that, it does, is this working? Yes.
Yep.
You said that it's quite a simple story, 2 threads, 2 people telling the story. But was it really difficult to find out how to tell the story and to choose the characters? And did you ever consider telling it from Dora's point of view?
It was a technical issue, and if I had told it from Dora's point of view, it would be quite hard because she dies. And as I said before, I didn't really want to have this kind of detective thing. So it was a puzzle that I had to solve. It was a technical puzzle about how to tell the story. And I think everybody who writes has to work out that kind of thing at the outset. It is kind of... it was hard to get it to settle, and then it did. And but I had moments where my husband was drawing kind of Venn diagrams of the narrative structure for me, saying, "Oh, it's actually really easy. We've got this one and this one." But I think really what I liked about that structure was that I could have it sail really very close to the truth of what happened. I didn't have to invent a detective. I didn't have to bring anybody back to life. I could have... It was inspiring to me to be able to think that this could have been how Toller was thinking. and this could have been how Ruth was thinking, and I quite like that.
There's a questioner down there. Thanks.
First of all, I've been scribbling notes madly, but I'm not Stasi. It's just very interesting. I'm just interested, you said at the start you played up the fact that a lot of this is fiction, yet you also said you over-researched and spent 18 months on this. How do you, obviously been able to be very truthful because of that amount of research, how do you balance that? How do you know when to stop? Because obviously you have been able to get quite close to the heart of things by knowing the truth so well.
Well, I think it's important to say that the plot, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is obviously made up. You know, I don't really think, even after a couple of glasses of champagne, that I have solved a 76-year-old murder mystery. I really don't, and I didn't set out to do it.
It's a very plausible solution, though.
That's because the book is plausible. I liked the research because I like to know what people ate and what they wore. I like to know that there were nightclubs I had a lot of fun with this nightclub scene in Berlin. I've made up this nightclub, I stuck it underground. As far as I know, there wasn't any underground, but there were nightclubs that had that had naked people in them, standing as statues, just for your edification, and that also had vacuum tubed kind of things that went all over the room where you could ring on a telephone and order up, a little vial of cocaine for someone that you might have been wanting to give it to or something. Those kinds of things were lovely to find out. But at some point you have to really stop and you have to put it away and you have to say the most important task is to make these people live. And that's actually got nothing to do with what you know. You could know a vast mountain of stuff about cocaine and vacuums and trivia, and that's not the job. The job is to make somebody fall in love for plausible reasons, make that not work for plausible reasons, make somebody overestimate themselves for reasons that the reader can see coming, but their wife couldn't see coming, or whatever it is. And those things are the sort of very basic pleasures of fiction writing, I think.
Another question. Thanks.
Yeah, Anna, did your friend Ruth know you were writing the book? Were you writing it before she passed away? And what do you think she'd kind of think about the book?
That's a good question. I did a series of interviews with Ruth in the mid-90s. So she died in 2001. And then when I was pregnant with my first child, waiting for Stasiland to come out in the interim between finishing it and it coming out, I turned those, which had been done in the 1990s, into a radio documentary. So she certainly knew that I was, and she was very happy that I was taking down her story. When Charmian Brinson, whose book is the only other thing about Dora that exists, when Ruth was, about 92 or something, she came to the door, and one time I visited her and said, "Look, they're writing about me." And she was very happy that this historian had written a chapter in a book. The historian's specialty is these refugees in London in the 30s, and there's a chapter about Ruth. And but she didn't know I was writing this book because I started this in 2006 and she was already dead in 2001. That's why the present day part of this is set in 2001. But whether she'd like it or not, look, I think she would, but I don't know, I think she would. I think that I'm not, of course, it's a pleasure for me to kind of, in a sense, imagine that I'm honouring these people. But the characters are also, I'm quite sure, different from how they really were, by necessity. I've found, in my experience, if you write about anybody, even somebody you know really well, they either won't recognise themselves, or they won't like it, or they will recognise themselves in someone else entirely. So,
and there's a lady here, and then there's a gentleman up the back as well. But go ahead.
I was wondering if you can assay your brother's fears and return to the Melbourne story and the Tulip Tree.
Well, he just said that's a bit close to home, isn't it? And then more recently I went and had a look at that bit of manuscript that I'd been writing, and there are bits of it that are, funny and good and salvageable, and there are bits of it that aren't. So I don't know, I might revisit that in some form or other. But, I really have had the experience where people see themselves in... I have one relative who I love really dearly, who said to me at one point, before All That I Am came out, said to me, "I hear you're writing a novel." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I hear it's about the family." I said, "Nah, not really." And then he said, "Well, like the last one, eh?" And I said, "What?" Anyway, he'd seen himself in some minor character in Stasiland.
Was he the one taking notes at the Australian launch of the book?
It is extremely, in one way, it's fantastic because you want people to recognise bits of themselves or bits of other people that they know. I mean, to make anybody live, you're trying to tap into something that we all know and recognise. I'm rereading Anna Karenina at the moment just because I need to, sit in a hotel room and read something fantastic. And I recognise all those people, I know Vronsky and I know Nablonsky and I know all these people. And so if something's any good, you're quite happy that they recognise themselves. You just don't want to hurt your family.
Just don't go near any trains. So.
No trains.
There's a gentleman at the back. This must be the last question because we're actually over time. So please.
Sort of a general question. Is it possible, both Stasi and the novel, to acquire what you might call a true sense of the times, an understanding of, let's say, how things were the way they were? So take 31. I mean, the truth of what was going on and why it was not something else.
That's a very good question. I think that we all see things slightly differently. And if you're telling a story of a particular time, you'll be telling it about that time from a particular point of view with all its limitations, so mine or whatever. There are people in Stasiland who say it was fine under the East German regime, it was terrific, it was better than capitalism, we had no poverty, we had no prostitution, there were no drugs. As long as you stayed away from the wall, you'd be all right. And only an idiot went near the wall, and only an idiot stuck their nose out. And so they would not see this as a true representation of the times. I can't... Everything that you read about the 30s and the early 30s in Germany and the early 30s in London, and I've read a stack and really enjoyed it, it all has a slightly different tone. So I don't know, it's not really my aim to say this is absolutely how it was, because I'm not sure that can be done. It's more to set things credibly and as truthfully as possible about people in that time. But I don't make claims for this is... I don't even think historians do anymore, actually. I don't.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have run out of time. Anna talked about wanting to make her characters live in All That I Am. Well, I've read the book and I think they certainly do live. So, Anna, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Jason.